Welcome to our program, Lough.
Hello. Very good to be with you again. Thank you.
I would like to cover current state of Putin's grip on power and his recent decisions. Putin's days are numbered. That's what you said during a recent interview on Times Radio. What is your assessment of the current decision made by the Kremlin regarding the possible transition of power or something else related to this sensitive matter?
Well, let me put this in context. I say that Putin's days are numbered because I think he knows that he's just turned 73, that the laws of biology suggest that he's not going to be in power eternally, despite his recent conversation with President Xi about the possibility of living to 150. So he and his, I think, close associates are preparing the ground for the fact that they will have to transfer power to other people. And that's something that we can probably envisage happening in the next, let us say, 5 to 7 years. It may, of course, even be earlier, depending on Putin's health and, of course, how things develop in Russia itself. But what we can detect is that there are appointments being made at the moment in various parts of the Russian system that are designed, I think, for this transition that will gradually take place. And we can see those appointments at different levels. And they include war veterans. They include children of people who are very close to Putin or considered to be close to Putin. So it's quite clear that the system is preparing for the next stage of its development. But I don't see any dramatic events on the immediate horizon. This is going to be, I think, a gradual process. But of course, what the Kremlin wants to prevent is that when that moment comes, when Putin steps aside or starts to step aside, perhaps that they're not caught out, that there isn't a degree of infighting, for example, that would destabilize the system. So I'm quite sure they've learned lessons from the transfer of power in Kazakhstan, for example, when President Nazarbayev effectively appointed a successor, kicked himself upstairs, was there to stabilize the system, but it actually became unstable at one point and then required intervention by Russia.
From your perspective, what are the chances for the change of course of Russian ruling elite, the change of course of Russian state?
Well, I don't see any possibility in the immediate future that we're going to see some change of course, perhaps as we did in the Soviet Union after the mid-1980s. The current elite is definitely set on a kind of compass bearing at the moment. And that's in large measure, I think, influenced by the war in Ukraine, this fateful decision that Putin took to launch the full-scale invasion and to initiate a degree of confrontation with the West that we, of course, have not seen since Cold War days. So for now, they're set on this course, but there will come a moment, and we've seen this at other points in history in Russia, where I think the ruling group will have to reassess its options in order to address the country's long-term future. But we're some way away from that now. But that moment will come, and at the moment we have very little idea of just who is going to be at the helm, the type of pressures that they will be under. Who knows how the world will look at that point? There's so much changing at the moment in terms of the way the United States is relating to Europe. The way, of course, China and Russia are both building their relations. What this will mean, longer term for Europe and the place of Ukraine, for example, this is all extremely hard to predict because we're living through a period of what I would simply describe as a revolutionary upheaval. But there will come a moment when Russian policymakers have, I think, choices, and it's important that Western countries, I believe, demonstrate to those people that, in fact, options do exist and that Russia doesn't have to continue down this road of self-isolation, this one of violence towards its neighbors and overall confrontation with the Western world.
And how can you assess the current level of support of this war effort against Ukraine among Putin's inner circle, Russian elites and other high-ranking military commanders, politicians?
Well, we have very little evidence because, of course, the Russian system is closed, and it's not a place where people can express their views or their feelings publicly. But we know from before the war started that there was certainly a section, and I think probably quite large section, of the Russian general staff, put it that way, probably the high command, that was skeptical about this operation that Putin was proposing. And some of those people correctly predicted that Russia would get bogged down in a longer war that would be extremely damaging for the country's long-term interests. And that is exactly what has happened. But the problem is that those people who were perhaps skeptical at the outset and may even be considered to have been opposed to the war, that they find themselves in a situation where they have really no option but to support what's going on at the moment because they don't want to see Russia's position worsen still further. So I think there are a lot of people there who've just accepted that Russia is at war and they have to support their country for now. What will happen when the war at some point comes to an end and then this history is re-examined of what actually happened, who was behind it, who was maybe lukewarm in their support, who was perhaps even against it, we may find out more. But I think you have to see that in Russia at the moment there are different constituencies. There is undoubtedly some people who are or were against the war from the outset, and Dmitry Kozak is held up as an example of one of these people. And I suspect there were more people in the military whose names we don't know yet or are unlikely to find out. But equally, you've got people who are, particularly in this sort of Z community, these patriotic bloggers and others, who are extremely supportive of what, in principle, the Russian state is trying to achieve, and believe that Putin is not being strong enough in bringing the war to Ukraine and simply not increasing the pressure in the way that he should, so almost accusing him of weakness. So there are some very, very different constituencies there.
Let's also cover ongoing Ukrainian campaign against Russia's oil refining capacity. According to President Zelensky, Russia has already lost at least 20% of its gasoline supply. And also there have been different estimates. 20–30% of Russia's oil refining capacity has been affected by intensified Ukrainian drone attacks inside Russia. If Ukraine continues to conduct this campaign, would it be more difficult for Putin to explain his population the main reasons behind these strikes on Russia's oil refining capacity, oil supplies?
I think undoubtedly so. If Ukraine is able to, I think, disrupt life in Russia to a greater extent, then yes, surely more questions will be raised about just what the purpose is of this war. And one has to say that I think Ukraine has been really quite effective in attacking the refining sector, in the oil refining sector that you refer to, and equally attacking export terminals, oil export terminals on the Baltic Sea. So this indicates that Ukraine has a level of capacity that it didn't possess, let's say, a year ago. We know also that flying Ukrainian drones, flying close to the main airports in Moscow, has created a degree of chaos even during the summer months, and probably many more Russians have become aware that the war is not just something distant; it's much closer to them. But I think it's quite another thing for Ukraine to probably reach that level where it could, let's say, disable 40 or 50% of the oil refining complex in Russia. That's something that would create vastly greater difficulties, because for now Russia has been, although there are shortages in some places, generally they are finding ways to supply the market, including taking refined product from Belarus and other places. So they're kind of coping at the moment. But I think if Ukraine can increase the frequency of those attacks, prevent the repair of those oil refineries taking place in the way that the Russians have done it up to now, then we could be looking at a different situation.
Also, yes, President Donald Trump says that he will increase pressure to reach a peace deal in Ukraine. He is confident that both Ukraine and Russia will someday agree on a ceasefire. What is your assessment of current stage of negotiations between Ukraine, Russia, and the US, and the potential for any kind of a settlement?
I think we're a long way from any form of settlement of this war. I personally don't believe that a settlement will be possible until Putin, in fact, leaves the Kremlin. So could there be some sort of ceasefire arrangement? Possibly. And it's clear at the moment that, I'm in Washington right now, that President Trump is preoccupied with other issues, and his Gaza peace effort seems to be bearing fruit. And that will be considered, I think, a remarkable success. And it's an indication that there is only actually one country, or perhaps one type of US president who can do this sort of thing. So is he going to be able to repeat that success in bringing the war in Russia, in Ukraine, to an end? So far, he hasn't been able to exert enough pressure, I think, on President Putin to make him realize there is no option but to negotiate. But there's no indication that Trump really wants to heap the pressure on Putin, although several people have said to me in recent days in Washington that Trump is genuinely frustrated with the way Putin has behaved. He felt that he offered him a deal back in, March, that from Putin's perspective should have been quite attractive. And yet Putin has kind of spat in his face, and despite the Alaska summit, where Trump quite literally rolled out the red carpet and in a way rehabilitated Putin internationally, that Putin hasn't reciprocated. So what are the options now for the White House? Well, the idea that more sanctions are really going to make a difference to Putin's calculations short term, I think that is naive. The Russian economy is going to be able to cope for a good while yet, and there's no possibility of choking off oil supplies or oil sales from Russia to China and India, because if that were to happen, if those Russian barrels were taken off the international market, then we were talking about enormous price spike. And according to some calculations, this would only cost the Russian budget probably around between $30 to $40 billion a year. And that's compared to a federal budget of around $400 billion. So the Russians would be able to manage that pressure even if it were possible. So my personal view is that the only way Putin is, I think, going to be influenced to come to the table is to realize that with the help of the United States, at least, Europe is going to continue to support Ukraine. It will buy weaponry from the US. The US will continue to provide intelligence. And the frozen Russian assets in Europe, for example, will be deployed to support Ukraine over the next maybe 2 to 3 years. And that if Putin wants his long war, he's going to get it. And that's something, I think, which would make him think again, because I don't think that he wants a long war. He still believes, and all the public communication suggests on his part, that he believes this war can be won quickly.
And also recently, President Trump suggested that he could provide Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk missiles. What are your thoughts on that possibility?
Well, it appears to be under discussion how serious this proposal is. Very difficult to say how many of these Tomahawk missiles would then be, in fact, supplied. Their impact would probably be quite small, given that Ukraine already has a deeper strike capability into Russia. But I think in just symbolically, it would be an important move. And Putin has already threatened that there would be consequences if this were to happen. But to get to that point, then I think this administration would have to become a lot more frustrated with Putin's behavior. We're not there yet, in my view.
And what would be needed from Putin's side to even frustrate more Trump's team?
Well, I think it would be probably the level of bombardment of Ukraine, which of course is happening every day, and it seems sort of increasingly so. I read the reports this morning, Washington time, of what happened last night. This energy infrastructure being steadily degraded. I think maybe there would be I don't know an attack that caused a large loss of civilian life or something of that kind, something that really transplanted Ukraine back into the headlines. At the moment it's just become a sort of standard story, hasn't it? That Ukraine's been attacked by 500 drones overnight. But let us say if there were to be, I think, further incursions into NATO airspace, whether it's by Russian fighter aircraft, whether it's by drones, whether there is evidence of more, let's say, Russian cyber activity that is considered hostile, then that calculation could change. But for the moment, I think Putin feels that he can manage this. He can steadily exert pressure on Ukraine without having to engage seriously in any sort of peace process to satisfy Trump. He's not afraid of sanctions from the US right now. So he's feeling super confident. His problem is that despite all his confidence, Ukraine is by and large holding strong, particularly on the front line, despite all the problems it faces. There has been the anticipated breakthrough that Putin seems to have been promising for months has simply not materialized. And as the winter sets in, of course, on the front line, a lot of that ground initially turns to marsh. The leaves fall off the trees, and they can't continue to fight in the same way that they did over the last 6 months or so. So we're entering a critical phase of the war. I think how Ukraine gets through this winter, and given Russia's ability to strike, I think more effectively, critical infrastructure. This is going to be very challenging. So could there be more calls, particularly in Europe, for some sort of effort to provide greater air defense to Ukraine, even perhaps establish some form of sky shield, as it has been discussed. Who knows? But I think we're at the point where we could see some very interesting things happen that have far-reaching consequences.
Thank you, John, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you.